Picture this. It's a moonless night in 1542, and you're hiding behind the most exquisite silk curtains you've ever seen. Your heart is pounding so loud you're sure everyone can hear it. Around you, 16 young women, some barely older than your granddaughter, are moving like shadows through the emperor's bedchamber. One girl, just 14 years old, holds a silk ribbon in her trembling hands. It's the same ribbon her mother braided into her hair the last time she saw her, 3 years ago. Now she's using it to try to strangle the most powerful man in China. Can you imagine the courage that took? These weren't trained assassins or hardened criminals. These were teenagers who had been torn from their families and locked away in the Forbidden City. They knew that if they failed, and they probably would fail, they would face the most horrific death imaginable. But they also knew that living one more day under Emperor Jiajing's rule might be worse than dying. The ribbon catches around the emperor's throat, but their hands are shaking too much. They've never killed anyone before. They tie the wrong kind of knot. The emperor stirs, and in that moment, these brave young women seal their fate. But let me tell you why they were willing to die rather than continue living in what the world called a palace paradise. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden truths of history, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from today? It amazes me that we can share these ancient stories together across continents, connected by our curiosity about the women who came before us. Now, when most people think of the Forbidden City, they picture tourist postcards. Those magnificent red walls, golden roofs gleaming in the sunshine, architectural wonders that take your breath away. What they don't see are the invisible chains that bound 20,000 women at a time within those beautiful walls. Let me paint you a different picture. Imagine you're a 14-year-old girl from a small farming village. You've never been more than 10 miles from your home, never seen a building taller than your village temple. Suddenly, imperial officials arrive and announce that you've been chosen for the palace. Your mother weeps as they take you away, but there's nothing she can do. Fighting the emperor's selection would mean death for your entire family. So she kisses your forehead one last time and watches as you disappear into a convoy heading toward Beijing, toward a life she knows will break your spirit. The journey to the Forbidden City takes weeks. You're traveling with dozens of other girls, all between 14 and 16, all torn from their families. Some cry constantly. Others stare ahead with empty eyes. A few try to stay brave, telling jokes or sharing stories from home. But you all know the truth. You'll never see your families again. When you finally arrive at the Forbidden City, the scale overwhelms you. The walls stretch higher than mountains. The courtyards are larger than your entire village. The corridors seem to go on forever, filled with the rustling of thousands of silk gowns and the whispered conversations of women speaking languages you don't recognize. The smell hits you next. Not the fresh air and wood smoke of home, but incense mixed with fear and something else you can't identify that makes your stomach turn. It's the metallic scent of absolute power, and you're learning what it costs. For over 2,000 years, Chinese emperors maintained harems that housed up to 20,000 women at once. 20,000! That's larger than many cities today. Each emperor's reign brought new selections, new tragedies, new girls disappearing forever behind those red walls. The selection process was ruthless beyond imagination. Every 3 years, officials swept through the empire like locusts, searching for girls who met their impossible standards. Beauty was important, yes, but bloodline mattered more. Virtue, character, behavior, all judged by men who would decide these girls' fates in minutes. Once selected, a girl entered a world designed to break her spirit and remake her as property. The hierarchy was everything. At the top sat the empress, the emperor's one official wife, revered as the mother of the world. Below her stretched endless ranks of consorts, concubines, and servants, each fighting for scraps of attention that might mean the difference between life and death. But here's what the history books rarely mention: the physical torture that began in childhood to prepare girls for this honor. I need to warn you, dear listener, this next part is difficult to hear, but these women's suffering deserves to be acknowledged, not hidden. Many girls selected for the Imperial Harem had endured footbinding since they were 4 years old. Picture a mother holding down her screaming toddler while wrapping cloth so tightly around tiny feet that it cuts off blood circulation. The goal was to break the bones and fold the foot in half, creating the lotus bud shape that men found beautiful. The process took years. As the bones broke and reset, as toes rotted and fell off, as the arch collapsed, these little girls learned that love came with torture. Their own mothers, the people who should protect them, caused them agony every day while telling them it was for their own good. By the time these girls reached the palace, they could barely walk. They certainly couldn't run, and that was exactly the point. Women with bound feet were prisoners of their own bodies, completely dependent on others for mobility. Even if they somehow escaped the palace walls, they'd be recaptured within hours, hobbling painfully through streets they couldn't navigate. In the harem, this physical helplessness became another tool of control. The most favored concubines had to be carried naked to the emperor's bed because they couldn't walk there themselves. Imagine the humiliation, the complete loss of dignity and agency. Now let me tell you about Emperor Jiajing, the man those 16 brave women tried to kill that night in 1542. Understanding him helps us understand why they chose death over continued life under his rule. Jiajing was obsessed with immortality, convinced he could live forever if he just found the right formula. And he believed the key ingredient was the menstrual blood of virgin girls. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't metaphorical, this wasn't symbolic. The Emperor of China, one of the most powerful men who ever lived, was literally harvesting the menstrual blood of children for a magic potion he thought would make him immortal. He kept hundreds of girls around age 13, feeding them only mulberry leaves and rainwater, because he believed this would keep their blood pure. Picture these children. They should have been playing with friends, learning to read, helping their mothers with household tasks. Instead, they were locked in chambers like laboratory animals, their growing bodies monitored for signs of sexual development. Every month during their cycles, these girls were examined and their blood collected by court physicians. They were treated exactly like livestock being milked for product. The girls who produced the most blood received slightly better treatment. Those whose cycles were irregular were beaten or thrown away entirely. When some girls fell ill from malnutrition because mulberry leaves and rainwater couldn't sustain growing bodies, they were punished for becoming sick. The emperor blamed them for disrupting his immortality project rather than recognizing that he was slowly starving children to death. In 1552, he decided the girls weren't young enough, so he brought in 200 8-year-olds. 8-year-olds! Children who hadn't even reached puberty yet, imprisoned while the emperor waited for their bodies to develop so he could harvest their menstrual blood. Guards watched these little girls like hawks, noting physical changes, preparing them for a future of systematic bleeding for an emperor's impossible dream. Meanwhile, Jiajing had completely withdrawn from governing his empire. While his people faced famines and invasions, while his kingdom crumbled, he focused entirely on his twisted pursuit of immortality through the blood of children. This is the world those 16 women lived in when they made their fateful decision in 1542. They had watched friends disappear into the emperor's laboratories. They had seen girls their own age growing weaker from malnutrition, their bodies harvested like crops. They lived knowing they were nothing more than blood-producing machines for a madman's delusions. So on that moonless night, when Emperor Jiajing lay sleeping in his favorite concubine's chambers, 16 women decided they'd rather die fighting than live as victims one more day. Picture them planning this for weeks, maybe months. They had to coordinate in complete secret, knowing that discovery meant not just their own deaths, but torture for anyone who had helped them. They communicated through glances and gestures, through coded conversations about silk and poetry that were actually about murder and freedom. They practiced tying knots in darkness, tested the strength of curtain cords, decided who would hold the emperor down and who would pull the noose tight. These weren't trained killers. They were young women who had been taught music and calligraphy, not assassination techniques. When the moment came, their inexperience showed. The girl with the silk ribbon, that 14-year-old whose mother had braided it into her hair 3 years earlier, her hands shook so badly she couldn't tie a proper strangling knot. When they tried again with a curtain cord, they made the same mistake. Their failure sealed their doom. One of the conspirators panicked and reported the assassination attempt to Empress Fong. By the next afternoon, all 16 women were sentenced to death by 1,000 cuts, a form of execution designed to maximize suffering over several days. But here's what breaks my heart. Even knowing they would probably fail, even knowing the consequences, these young women chose to try. They decided that death fighting back was better than life as victims one more day. What does that tell you about the daily horror they endured? Some women survived the harem system by learning to play its games better than anyone else. The most successful was a woman who started as a low-ranking concubine and ended up ruling China for almost 50 years. Her name was Cixi, though when she entered the palace she was just called Lady Orchid. She was probably 16 or 17 when she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son, and that single biological fact changed her life forever. Suddenly, she wasn't just another concubine waiting for the emperor's attention, she was the mother of the heir to the throne. When her husband died in 1861, Cixi saw her chance to seize real power. But here's the tragic part. Instead of using her power to reform the system that had victimized her, she made it worse. She spent 47 years as the real ruler of China, and she used every tool of oppression that had once controlled her to control other women. When her son married and his wife gave birth to a baby boy, Cixi realized the child was a threat to her power, so she ordered her own grandson killed. When her daughter-in-law tried to build a normal marriage relationship with the emperor, she had them both poisoned rather than share influence. The woman who had once been a powerless victim had learned the harem's lessons too well. Trust no one, eliminate threats before they become dangerous, and never show mercy to anyone who might challenge your position. Fast forward to 1900 and meet Consort Zhen, a young woman whose story shows us a different kind of courage. Unlike most concubines who learned to stay invisible and silent, Zhen was curious about the world beyond China's borders. She read foreign newspapers when she could get them, asked questions about Western technology, and encouraged Emperor Guangxu to pursue reforms that might modernize China. In a palace where women were expected to be decorative and voiceless, she was intelligent and outspoken, and she paid the price for it. Empress Dowager Cixi, that same woman who had risen from concubine to ruler, became jealous of Zhen's influence over the emperor. In 1894, she had Zhen demoted and flogged for interfering in political affairs. Imagine being stripped and whipped by eunuchs because you encouraged your husband to improve his country. But Zhen's real crime wasn't political interference. Her offense was being young, intelligent, and genuinely loved by the emperor, while Cixi grew older and felt her control slipping. The end came in 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, when foreign armies occupied Beijing and the imperial court fled the city. As they prepared to leave, Cixi made a final, brutal decision about Consort Zhen. She summoned the 24-year-old woman and said, "I originally planned to bring you with us, but you are young and pretty and likely to be raped by foreign soldiers on the way. I trust you know what you should do." This was the language of false mercy, ordering someone to commit suicide while pretending it was protection. But when Zhen refused to kill herself and instead begged that the emperor stay to negotiate with the foreign powers, Cixi's mask fell away entirely. "Throw her in the well," she ordered. Picture that final confrontation between two women whose lives had been shaped by the same brutal system. Cixi, now in her 60s, had survived by becoming more ruthless than anyone else. Zhen, at 24, still believed that reason and compassion could prevail. Consort Zhen's final moments were terrifying beyond imagination. The well was narrow and deep, maybe 20 or 30 feet down to stagnant water. She would have fallen in darkness, probably breaking bones against the stone walls, then drowned slowly and alone, knowing no one was coming to save her. Her body wasn't recovered until the following year. The well still exists in the Forbidden City today, a small hole in the ground that tour guides point out as a historical curiosity. But every time I think about it, I see a brave young woman who refused to stay silent, even when speaking up cost her everything. Let me put the scale of the system in perspective for you. Some Ming emperors had 9,000 concubines. 9,000! If an emperor lived 40 years after taking the throne and wanted to meet each concubine just once, he'd need to see a different woman every night for 25 years. That means thousands of women spend their entire lives in the palace without ever speaking to the man whose property they supposedly were. They woke up every morning wondering if today would be the day they were chosen. They practiced conversation topics, perfected their appearance, rehearsed how they would behave if summoned. Years passed. Their hair began to gray. Other women were selected, some multiple times, while they remained invisible. Gradually, they understood they would live and die as prisoners who never even met their captor. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine trying to form friendships in an environment where your friend's promotion could mean your demotion, where showing too much affection could be seen as forming dangerous alliances, where every conversation was monitored by eunuchs who reported to higher authorities. The system deliberately prevented genuine relationships between women, knowing that isolated individuals were easier to control than communities of support. Women could form friendships, but competition for the emperor's attention poisoned many relationships. Your friend's success could mean your failure, and your failure might mean punishment or death. What strikes me most about these stories isn't the scale of the suffering, though that's heartbreaking enough. It's the courage of the women who resisted. Those 16 women who tried to strangle Emperor Jiajing knew they were choosing death, but they chose it anyway. Consort Zhen could have stayed silent and protected her position, but she chose to speak truth to power. These women deserve to be remembered not as romantic figures in palace dramas, but as real people who faced impossible choices with extraordinary courage. Think about what it took for those 16 women to make their decision. They planned for weeks while continuing to endure the conditions that made death seem preferable to life. They spent weeks living with the knowledge that they were choosing torture and execution, while still facing the daily horror that drove them to that choice. Consort Zhen's courage was different, but equally remarkable. She had achieved the highest status possible for a palace woman, the emperor's favorite. She could have protected that position by staying quiet. Instead, she chose to use her influence for reforms that would benefit the country, even knowing it made her a target.
When Cixi ordered her to commit suicide, Zhen refused and used her final moments to advocate for negotiation rather than flight. Even facing death, she chose to think about the good of the empire rather than her own survival. That kind of moral courage is extraordinary under any circumstances, but it's particularly remarkable from someone raised in a system designed to crush independent thinking and replace it with total obedience. The Imperial Harem system officially ended in 1912 with the fall of the Qing dynasty, but its lessons about power, control, and resistance echo through time. When we visit the Forbidden City today, we see tourists taking selfies in courtyards where women were tortured to death. We see gift shops selling romantic novels about harem intrigue. We hear guides praising architectural achievements while barely mentioning the human cost of those beautiful buildings. But if you know where to look, you can still see the well where Consort Zhen drowned. You can see the walls that imprisoned thousands of women. You can see the chambers where children were bled for an emperor's impossible dream of immortality. The buildings are magnificent, but they're also monuments to systematic horror that lasted over 2,000 years. Perhaps the most tragic aspect is how thoroughly this suffering has been romanticized in modern culture. Walk into any bookstore and you'll find shelves of novels about clever concubines who win the emperor's love through wit and beauty. Turn on television and you'll see lavishly produced dramas where actresses in gorgeous costumes compete for imperial affection. These stories focus on the rare women who gained power within the system, while erasing the experiences of millions who suffered in silence. When we emphasize the luxury and beauty of palace life, we ignore the footbinding, the forced blood harvesting, the drownings in wells, the deaths by 1,000 cuts. Understanding the Imperial Harem isn't just about understanding Chinese history. It's about understanding how systems of oppression function, how they perpetuate themselves across generations, and how they shape entire cultures. The harem system survived for over 2,000 years because it convinced society that this was normal, natural, even beautiful. Women's suffering became entertainment. Their deaths became footnotes. Their lives became decorative elements in stories about male power. This normalization was perhaps the system's greatest achievement and most insidious legacy. When horror becomes routine, when violence becomes expected, when human suffering is treated as the natural cost of maintaining power, entire societies become complicit in oppression.
But here's what gives me hope. The stories of resistance survive too. Every time someone tells the truth about the Imperial Harem, the foot-binding and blood harvesting, the assassination attempts and drownings, the courage and the horror and the systematic dehumanization of millions of women, those 16 women who tried to strangle Emperor Jiajing achieve a small victory. Every time someone refuses to romanticize palace life and instead honors the reality of women's experiences, Consort Zhen's voice echoes once more from that well in the Forbidden City. Their resistance lives on in our refusal to forget, in our insistence on truth over comfort, in our recognition that the courage of women facing impossible circumstances deserves to be remembered and honored, rather than hidden behind beautiful lies. The empire that enslaved these women is gone, but their courage remains, a testament to the power of human dignity even in the face of absolute oppression. When you hear romantic stories about ancient Chinese palaces, remember the real women behind those walls. When you see beautiful architecture, remember the invisible chains that bound 20,000 women at a time. When someone tries to convince you that things were different back then, remember that they weren't different for the women who chose death over continued victimization. Their stories deserve better than to be reduced to romantic fantasies or historical footnotes. They deserve to be remembered as they were, human beings who faced systematic horror with whatever courage they could muster, and who proved that even the most complete systems of control cannot entirely crush the human spirit. The walls of the Forbidden City still stand, red and gold under the Beijing sun. But the women who once lived behind those walls, who died behind those walls, who chose resistance even when it meant certain death, their stories are finally free to be told without the filters that have obscured them for centuries. And that, dear friend, is its own kind of victory. Thank you for joining me on this journey through these hidden stories. If these forgotten voices have moved you as much as they've moved me, please share their stories with others. The courage of these women deserves to be remembered, and their truth deserves to be told.